Hello, everybody. It's a privilege and honor to be with you, to be able to share my ideas today at this conference, the best and the brightest in English language teaching. I want to thank the organizers, the British Council, for inviting me. My name is Lesley Painter-Farrell, and I'm currently the TESOL coordinator at Westchester Community College in New York, which is a state university. I train teachers in a teacher training program, and I teach beginner level students, A0 and A1, on the Common European Framework. That's kind of my specialty. The demographic that I work with is immigrants, refugees, migrants, and people seeking asylum. It's the largest institute in New York. They serve over 1,000 students every year, running up to about 5,000 students. The students are primarily from South and Central America, but other significant groups include growing body of students seeking asylum from Ukraine. So I'm very happy to be with you today. So what I'd like to do initially is explain a little bit about my context, and that is my building that you can see on the left-hand side of the page. It's a picture of the Gateway building, which is in Westchester. As I said, it's a community college, it's a state university. As the name sort of explains the aim of the building, it's a gateway, and it's supposed to be a gateway for students. The design is two wings, a little bit difficult to see here, but those are supposed to represent open and welcoming arms to our students. And to just discuss the student body a little bit, they are highly diverse, or what we now describe as super diverse, because they have different cultural, educational, socioeconomic, and linguistic backgrounds. They may vary in terms of the level of literacy in their home languages. Their education may have been interrupted, which means for periods of time they haven't attended school, or it's incomplete, meaning that they may be finished before graduating from high school. Many find learning English very, very difficult. In fact, that's the kind of key complaint that I ever hear. English is difficult, and maybe some of you can identify that with that. And many of the students have had very little experience of being in an educational setting, so we would say inexperienced. Additionally, in my context, their status in the US is fragile, given the current anti-immigrant rhetoric that we constantly hear in both media and the political domain. So in other words, these students bring many challenges to my classroom, which could potentially impede their learning, lead to high rates of attrition, slow down their progress, and certainly their perceived ability towards being successful language learners. Even though motivation is high as well, I would say that that's fragile for a variety of reasons, from workplace to having to look after children, all sorts of different things. So this is what's led me to this presentation. Over the last 4 years, my research has predominantly been in how can we as practitioners address our varying students' needs and ensure their success in learning English. Or in other words, for me, quite literally, how do we get our students to the next level so that they constantly progress? How can we help them do that as well expeditiously? So especially given the many detrimental factors which surround them. So it may seem aspirational, and I'm sure it's not a question that any teacher hasn't already asked themselves many, many times. So I hope in some small way, by sharing the work that I've done and what I kind of feel I've come up with, that I'll help teachers and I'll help you today. So my agenda, it looks fairly ambitious, but hopefully we'll get through it. I want to explore the construct of what teaching for success is and why it's important. I specifically want to present concrete ideas so that we can think of practical outcomes for our students. And I've divided the presentation into two parts. The first part will look at teacher and learner attitude to themselves. And that starts with the construct of an asset-based mindset. Then we'll move on to community, the importance of community, reflective practice, and teacher positionality. So those kind of initial areas, as I said, look at teacher and student attitude. Then we'll move on to the second part of the presentation, which looks more at the practical engagement with learning itself. So in other words, what practical ways can we implement in our classrooms that will expedite our students' learning? I've broken them down, and the research that I've looked at have been memory, particularly memory retrieval, also repetition, spaced repetition especially, and then we'll talk about other sort of actionable strategies as well as reflective learning. I want to end today on some questions, so I hope you bear with me, but what I really need you to do, and I'm sure you've got a notepad with you, I'd like you to have a notepad and pen, because as we go through this presentation, I'm going to pose questions, and not necessarily that you need to answer them as I go through the presentation, but I just need you to take notes of them. I'm going to set you homework, and ultimately I'm going to end on a cliffhanger question, the ultimate question, which I won't explain now. And as I said, it's a cliffhanger. So as I said, ambitious, but I'm sure we'll do it. So initially, let's think about what's meant by teaching for success, which, as I said, is the overarching topic that I want to look at today. So teaching for success involves a multifaceted approach to the classroom, and really moves beyond the kind of traditional academic approach that we may employ. It encompasses implementing strategies in the classroom which cater to the student's experience of being a student, and our awareness of what contributes to successful language learning. In other words, we begin to think about the science of learning, what it involves, what it entails. It focuses on the students' needs and catering to their varying learning experiences and preferences. And it sort of cultivates, as I've said on the screen, a growth mindset. Now, this is an interesting construct to think about. Instead of, and this is what happens with my students, they are adult students. As I said, they've got many sort of factors which might impede their learning, and it could lead to a fixed mindset, meaning that even though they do attend classes, they don't actually believe that they can progress. They've sort of got an idea that, as I said, English is very difficult. And as soon as it gets very difficult, maybe they drop out, maybe they don't try very hard. Instead, what we as teachers want to do is really cultivate a growth mindset. And in other words, it's a can-do attitude that, of course, you don't know it yet. And the word yet is critically important. It means that we need to look at their needs, we need to look at the students' learning preferences, and we need to work with them. Not only that they themselves identify their needs and their learning preferences, but also that we can identify them to obviously do things in class which address them. It also, teaching for success also means resilience. It means building adaptability, maintaining motivation. And ultimately, I think the goal is to equip students with the tools to navigate the complexities of language learning and achieve success. So one of the things I think we do have to address is that learning any language is difficult. So understanding the experience of the students in the classroom is important, whatever that means. And as we go through this presentation, we'll discuss this. So if I was going to talk to you as a New Yorker, then basically I'd say it means going to bat for our students, right? Having them on our side and working the best we can. So now let's just break it down a little bit more granularly. So as I said, we're going to look at sort of more teacher and student attitudes initially. So this is really a construct in terms of the teachers. So an asset mindset. So often as teachers, we're rooted in what the students cannot do rather than maybe what they can. For example, my students forget the third person S. They forget the auxiliary do. They forget articles. It's a deficit mindset. In other words, we think about what they can't do. That's our focus. An asset mindset really turns that around and instead thinks about what students can't do, it focuses on what they can do. So instead of saying things such as, look, they're working on the third person S, they're finding it difficult. Let's explore what they can do, right? Keeping the work that they are able to do very much front and center, and build on what they can do obviously with what they can't do. So acknowledging what they can't. Now, of course, it's important to assess our students to realize what they can't do and all of those things that I've just mentioned, because ultimately that is what informs our curriculum. We're both relevant and responsive. We hear a problem that our students have and then we address it in the classroom. That's not going to change. But let's marry that with acknowledging what they can do. So, for example, one of my students recently, finally, after teaching him many, many times, and as I said, I typically teach level 0, he actually stopped me in class last Friday and said, "How do I say in English?" Now, previously, he'd been saying, "Como se dice?" And I kept changing and said, "Let's keep it to English." So instead, let's celebrate that. And so what I asked him to do was, once he'd said it, I got him to repeat it in front of the class. I got him to write it up on the board, and then he kind of got the other students to repeat it. So in other words, we celebrated it by sharing it. And that's a really important piece of an asset mindset, that not only do you acknowledge what the students get right, but if possible, you allow them to share this with the students and then ultimately go ahead and teach it. This ultimately is what we call leveraging their strengths and exploiting them to foster growth. So whatever I can see in the classroom, if a student can pronounce something correctly and other students may be having difficulty with something, or if a student knows a word that maybe the other students don't know or don't know yet, get that student to share it with the rest of the group. And it doesn't matter on the level. Exploit those to just foster growth, and you'll notice a big change in motivation when that happens. Basically, even if we do see things that the students struggle with, failure really is an opportunity to growth. So another issue, or another thing that often I say to students is, if a student does make an error or make a mistake, then I often say, "Great, thanks, because now we can all learn. Let's listen to this." So it really is helpful to have the student who's prepared to make mistakes and experiment. Failure is not the limit of someone's abilities. Now, we all kind of as teachers fall foul of this sometimes when we see a student's inability maybe to do something, that we stop at that. And maybe we can't quite see how do we get further. Well, let's really not limit our own students, let's not label them too early. Also, I think it's recognizing that language development really is different for different students. It has a different pace. Also, it sort of results in can-do activities. So activities that students can do, sprinkled with activities that they can't do. So maybe, for example, students do a gap fill, it's easy for them, they find it, it's not a challenge. But then after that, they do a dictation type of activity, which they do. So maybe once we've done the dictation, can we go back to the can-do activity, the gap fill, and maybe look at that again, so that we're constantly bolstering motivation, that the students can see what they can't do, but they equally can see what they can do, and they focus more on what they can do rather than what they can't. This, as you've just seen, is task repetition, and I cannot say this enough. I know a lot of teachers don't like to repeat things because they feel that students get bored of activities, and I'm not necessarily meaning in the same lesson, but over a series of lessons. If students like doing, for example, a picture dictation, they can do it, then why not do it again in a couple of lessons from then? And why not do it again a few lessons after that? So in other words, we're repeating a task, we know that they can do it, and of course practice makes perfect, so it's always going to be useful. We know that what we need to do is believe in our students, but equally I think how we model that we believe in our students, they themselves realize that they can succeed and develop a belief in themselves. So this is my first question to you. Remember, I said that I was going to ask questions as we went through it. So I just want a little bit of reflexivity. Do you think that you have an asset mindset? And if you do, what evidence do you have of that? So my question is, do you think you have an asset mindset? And if you do, what evidence do you have? Okay. Moving on. So I mentioned also the importance of community. Again, I cannot state this enough, how important this is for our students. In a plenary that was at IATEFL this last year, Divya Madhavan said a wonderful thing, and she said, excellent teaching is when a teacher facilitates the growth of a community. Now, if you think about it, a community is where students feel comfortable with one another. They feel able to experiment with their language use. They feel able to try new things, and they don't mind making mistakes in one another. So, of course, that's going to lead to successful learning, because we know that the more we risk take, the more that we take experiment with our language learning and using, the better that we're going to progress. So, I think community starts with connections, and one of the things that I think we need to do, it's a very simple premise, is make sure that not only we are connected to our students, we know their names, we know where they come from, we know as much information as possible about them, but additionally, I think it's important that we make sure the students have connections between them for this very reason. So the word Ubuntu was given to me many, many years ago by my then boss. He told me this word. I'd never heard it before. It is an Afrikaans word. It's from South Africa, and it has many interpretations. The interpretation that really resonated with me is this idea that if I succeed, we all succeed. So this sort of promotes the idea of compassion in the classroom, of empathy, and of cooperation and collaboration. Meaning if I get something right and I can either share that with my students or my friends or my class colleagues, as I should say, then obviously they are going to be able to learn from what I already know, but then also feel maybe encouraged themselves to go further and learn more. So the concept of Ubuntu promotes qualities, as I said, compassion, empathy, cooperation. It emphasizes the importance of mutual respect within the classroom and understanding. And I don't know if any of you have read the book Howard's End. If you haven't, it's a book by E.M. Forster, and I strongly recommend. It's a very, very good book. In the epigraph, it says only connect. And it's a basic idea of if we all value one another and if we all try and understand one another, then obviously it's going to develop not only our relationships with one another, our ability to learn from and with one another, and of course, ultimately gain the success that we want. I think what's really important is ultimately what this means is listening, right? Listening to the people that we're with, listening to their stories, spending time working out our position and our experience in contrast to others. So community, what fosters it? Firstly, I want to talk about recognition, teacher recognition and student recognition of one another. It starts with names, that we all appreciate and know one another's names. We know where we come from. We know some information. That should then lead to, as I said, connections and respect. We can foster this by personalizing activities as much as possible. So rather than sort of saying, I don't know, John loves chocolate, let's find one of the students. Let's use their names instead. Let's bring it back to the realities within the classroom, what we know from the stories that we've heard from our students. And then additionally, let's use inclusive language. Now, this is, I think, a very important thing. Inclusive meaning that we really do include all of our students. We don't sort of say things like, you don't say that because we don't say that when you're correcting a student. We don't say that in English. Instead, why don't we try and say, it's interesting you said that. Let's say this, or let's try this. Now, what do you think? So don't make a distance between the language that the students are learning and themselves, and then each student. We'll talk a little bit about comparative learning as well, that often when inclusive language isn't used, students begin to compare their own learning to one another. So one student feels that they know more than the other, and consequently don't feel as compelled to either answer questions in class or join in pair work and different things like that. So it's quite destructive to the community itself. So many community building activities. I think another critical thing is realizing that community is about collaboration, but it can't happen in one lesson. And I know many teachers that I work with, they do one activity and then that's it. No, I think community building takes many community building activities over a series of lessons. We still use name cards in the beginner level really until about the middle of the semester, so that students are really aware of one another and their names and their importance of their names. I take the temperature of the classroom a lot. In other words, I try to find out how the students are, what they're doing, whether they feel comfortable or uncomfortable. And this is, again, very important to think about and to know. Now, in my beginner class, I might have little hands up or hands down. So thumbs up, thumbs down, whether they feel comfortable, or like this if they don't, or exit tickets. So I'm not sure how many of you use exit tickets, but at the end of the class, I might give a student a piece of paper to say, what they learned. So today I learned, or I can. And then how they feel. Was this good? Was it easy? Was it difficult? So I can constantly feed into, well, what is it that they're finding difficult? Where can I support them more? What should I be doing? So together, I think it's foundational for success to have this community. So this is my next question. What was the most recent community building activity that you've done? Just note that question down. What was the most recent community building activity that you have done? Another piece, as I said, teacher actions and teacher attitudes, is two parts. One, reflective practice, and then reflexivity itself. So we'll start with reflexive practice initially. So obviously when we reflect on our classrooms, we look at what happens, we look at whether our teacher, or we think our teaching was successful, whether we think that we covered the material that we wanted to, how the students responded or received our information. So in other words, we look backwards in order to constantly move forward and to look forward. Reflection. So we talk about it an awful lot in our teacher training programs and get often students to think about, the good things that happened, maybe the not so good things that happened, our takeaways, things that we would do differently. That's an important part of just ongoing practice of professional development, but as well as making sure that we are developing as teachers to help optimally our students. But then teacher reflexivity is a little bit different because it's more about thinking of our positionality compared to our students. Thinking about, our own ability maybe to learn language, how we're situated in comparison to maybe the challenges and the different situations that our students have. So I think one of the things is to look at it very mindfully. And I want to just give you a little bit of an idea or an example. So maybe last year, a trainee was working with some students and they were telling her about going to the mall, which, the store to buy things. It was just after Thanksgiving, which here in the US is a big sales day. So all of the stores have sales. Students were talking about this in class. They were excited. They were, getting things for the winter. They were going to send presents home to their families. And the teacher joined in. It was great. But then she said, well, I know a better mall for you to go to. And she started to talk about a mall that was much more expensive, that didn't really have an easy transport system to get to. And she was really looking at it from her perspective. And so afterwards, we had to kind of talk together about what was her assumption about what the students were able to do. And this might be as basic as thinking about, how much time do they really have for homework? As I've mentioned, my students are largely immigrants, refugees. A lot of them have the challenge of working. They're working very, very hard. They're trying to situate their families. Sometimes their families aren't here. They have very, very little free time. In fact, many of the students that we have, they do classes from 9 to 12. When they finish classes, they will then go on to their job, which could be 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon until late evening. Understanding that helps me think about, well, how can I better address their needs? I obviously do want them to do homework. I obviously want them to be able to succeed and not just do activities that are written activities or that take too long. So how can the things that I do in class really help them? One of the things that we've adopted here, for example, is using WhatsApp for homework. And I record things on WhatsApp. They listen to it while they're on the bus or while they're on the subway going home, and then they answer some questions and put it on WhatsApp. It's easy for them to do, but it shows a recognition that I know what kind of difficulties they're facing. So second question. Third question. What do I know about my students? What do I know about their situation and my own positionality and their needs? So that's kind of a bigger thing. And maybe thinking about, how does my teaching cater to the position that they are in? So this takes us to the next slide of positionality itself. And so this is a quote from Lisa Del Pitt that I really love, because interestingly, often looking at the materials that we use and thinking about the materials that we use, are they appropriate for our students? What kind of pictures are we showing? What visuals do they represent? And are they something that the students can relate to, that they can understand, appreciate, and ultimately feel motivated by? So the issues of power, she says, are enacted in classrooms. These issues include the power of the teacher over the students, the power of the publishers of textbooks and the developers of the curriculum to determine the view of the world presented. So that's my question. Does the view of the world within what we're presenting our students really represent the reality of our students? Obviously, the power of the state and enforcing compulsory schooling, and the power of an individual or group to determine another's intelligence or normalcy. Now, obviously, Del Pitt is moving the discussion quite a bit further than I'm talking about, but it is, again, all wrapped up with how we perceive our students, our attitude towards them, the community we build with them, our asset mindset that we might have, our belief in them, and then ultimately what we think about their learning, their positionality, that we can ensure we help them. So I'm going to shift the discussion a little bit more now towards really the sort of very practical, hands-on type of things. So as I mentioned when I said the agenda, we need to think about, well, successful learning. We've obviously got to study. We've obviously got to do some concrete things that will help our students. And what I want us to think about is memory. Now, memory in this field has kind of had a difficult relationship with us, with teachers, mostly because behaviorism has cast such a long shadow over what we do. And that, it's the idea that, is it just getting students to repeat things? Is it just rote memorization? Not much critical thinking. And of course, we're developing critical thinking. But memory underpins everything to do with language learning. Students have to remember things. And there's not many ways that we can move around that. So what we've got to think about is, how do we get our students to remember things? And I've put this as our fourth question. What do you do, maybe, or how do we ensure that our students remember what we teach? Is it about how we teach rather than simply the content of our classes? So this is the why. So if you have a look at this is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. I'm sure many of you have seen it. But once we teach something, it's wonderful to think, okay, the students are going to learn it, they're going to remember it. But in reality, what actually happens is that the students begin to forget immediately. And I'm learning Spanish, and I can say this is quite optimistic. I would say I definitely fall into this. So immediately we begin to lose at least 40% of what we've learned. Over an hour, you can see that it's gone down even more. And then by 31 days, so if we haven't repeated it, we've got very little left that the students have remembered. So we can compensate this with a few different things, and this is what I want to talk about now. But I think it's important for our field to embrace memory, to realize how important it is, and to incorporate activities in class which do address this. So let's look at this. First one that I want us to think about is memory retrieval. So very, very often what we do is we teach students, we teach them content. I'm absolutely sure that we teach them well, and the students understand us, and they do to a certain extent remember. But if we really want them to encode it and commit it to long-term memory, what we need to develop is a process of retrieval, meaning, in other words, that students not only have to memorize things, but they have to be able to retrieve what they've learned, and obviously use it. So for us, it might be vocabulary and grammar and lots of, things that we punch into our students, but they've got to be able to then use it. So there's different techniques that I've been experimenting with that I'm going to explain to you. Spaced repetition, active recall, and associative learning, all of which can enhance memory retrieval. Ultimately, the goal is to optimize the accessibility and accuracy of the information stored in the memory when it's needed. So if we start to think about practice, I want you to look at this coil, because basically this is exactly what our lessons over a semester should look like, this kind of spring. So rather than it being a straight line, so we start here, students don't know as much, and then they progress over time, and then by the end of the lessons they know more, so the end of the semester. Instead, why not let's think about this as a spiral, so that we teach, repeat, teach, repeat, teach, repeat, teach, repeat. And we go through our curriculum like that, as opposed to constantly moving through. So an activity that I've been working on a lot with students, at the beginning of a lesson maybe, or at the end of a lesson, depending, I say to students, write down 5 words you remember from the last class. And I mean the last class. Write down what we did in the last class. So not even essentially what they may have learned, but actually what we did. So can you remember if we did a role play, or if we worked in pairs? And then write down the key points of this presentation. So that's my piece of my activity for you. So in other words, getting students to actively remember something from previously, asking them questions, asking them to situate whatever they've remembered. And of course, different levels are going to have different things. I now have a routine at the beginning of my classes that it's 5 words, because as I said, I have level 0. So what I'm able to do with my students may be a little bit limited as compared to what you can do with your students. Equally, I think it's important for you to practice what you think should happen in a classroom. So try it. Write down the key points of what this presentation is after the presentation. See how much you remember that you can bring to mind. Don't look back at anything. Just don't look at your notes. Just see if you can actively recall. And let's try and do this. One of the pieces of research we're working on now is doing it actually midway through class. So our lessons are 3 hours long. They're long. I'm not sure if yours are as long as that, but maybe at 1.5 hours, so 1.5 hours into the lesson, stop, get the students to recall what we did from the beginning of the class to that, what the key points are, what the key takeaways are. And it's interesting, because the more that students do it, the more they're able to do it, and more they're ready to begin to actively engage in recall. It's also, I should just add, become important because they understand why memory is so important. Then spaced repetition, which, as I said, it kind of represents the coil on the screen, that students review material at strategically spaced intervals. So they constantly move forward, but then they look back, they move forward. And this is in part linked to task repetition. So again, think about what this might mean in your classroom and experiment with it. Put, do a task, and then 2-3 weeks later, do it again. And then 3 or 4 weeks after that, do it again. So this space to kind of repetition, and keep bringing back almost exactly what you taught before. So it isn't that we keep doing different things every lesson, that we actually do repeat things. So far, I can say that over the last few years, I can see a big difference in retention, confidence, and as I said, the students' belief in themselves, because it's not always new, they're not overloaded, we're not dealing with cognitive overload, we're really dealing with manageable amounts of material that, as I said, we repeat and we reuse. Another part of this is actually reflective learning. It links very much to memory. It's part of memory. But with reflective learning, imagine that, again, you've been in this this presentation. Maybe 2 hours after this presentation, sit down and reflect on it. Try and remember what was said, or what I said, obviously, because I'm the one doing the talking. But what was said, at what point was said it, can you remember any of the visuals? And I deliberately put visuals into this presentation so that we could do it. Can you remember the questions? Again, I deliberately put questions into this presentation because that primes you to kind of help you guide what you need to remember, kind of what's the important pieces of this presentation. But really to just sit and reflect. Again, we've done a lot of this with the students. We've also done a lot in the teacher training program, where we've had trainees sit down and just kind of go through, what did that lesson plan look like? What did we talk about? What do we need to remember? What are our takeaways? In a way, it means that the students are actively engaging in the process of learning, because they're thinking about self-awareness, what's working for me, what isn't working for me. I can remember this. How did I feel what I was doing, when we were doing that? What did I think about? What were the challenges for me? What was the easy things? What do I need to think about? Students should keep asking themselves, what helps me and what doesn't help me? Those are kind of the bottom lines. And obviously with the lower levels, it's tricky. But it's easy to see, a thumbs up. So when we did the WhatsApp listening activity, good, useful. And you'll begin to develop an understanding of what their learning preferences are, ultimately, to make sure that they will stay with me, that they won't drop out of classes. So question 6, what helps you to learn? So again, I think if we want to teach for success, thinking about what successful learning starts with us, right? It begins with what works, how do I learn, and then is there anything about the way I learn something that I could take into the classroom? What I want us to think about constantly, in a way, is making sure that students realize that they have, that they are in a position to make decisions about their own learning, that they can think about their own learning, and that they are not passive receptors of what the teacher says. That basically they should and they can have input in the way they learn, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And one of the things that we talk to the trainees in the teacher training courses regularly is that we all have an ability to help ourselves, acknowledge that, and make decisions based on, obviously, what our thoughts are. And I think that autonomy, again, is something that's important. We're working with our students. Of course, we're teaching them, but teaching and learning, it's a very symbiotic relationship. It's interactional. We sort of give our students something to do, they try and do it, and then we modify things. We're constantly getting feedback. And I think if students can understand that part of that is them, then they're more likely to take on self-directed learning. They're much more likely, I hope, or I think, to work outside class, which ultimately, I'm not sure about your situation, but ultimately for me, with my students that I work with, it's very much trying to get them to do additional work outside, constantly pushing them towards helping themselves. So this is kind of coming to the summation of what I want to talk about. So actionable strategies, one of them I'm going to make clear now. So what I'd love you to do, now that you've heard this presentation, is experiment with the ideas. And this is one method of active recall, which, as I said, I want you to do. So obviously, the first thing is 2 words, experiment with. In the presentation, I mentioned it. I'll give you a minute. Spaced repetition. I also said that we should engage in and if you say reflective learning and practice, then you are correct. I really want us to consider our position, and if you say positionality, then you're correct. And again, if you consider your mind set. So in other words, think about your attitude towards your learners. I know that we all love our students, but this is a little bit elevated in helping them understand what success is and ensuring that they know that we know they're very, very capable. The activity that we've just done, I strongly recommend it. You could do it at the beginning of the class. You could do it at your end of your lesson, where whatever it is that you want the students to remember, just maybe put the letters that the words begin with and then put them into pairs and let them think about it, and don't particularly let them look at their notes, but maybe after a while you do. It's a wonderful active recall method. If you wanted to gamify it, then you could get some, put them into teams and let somebody run to the board and fill in the gaps. As I said earlier, at the very beginning, I said there was a cliffhanger that I wanted to ask you really the ultimate question. So for me, this is the ultimate question. It's a tricky one. But I think we should always ask it, would I like to be taught by me? Right? Would I like to be taught by me? Reflect on that. Think about that. I think it's a good kind of barometer to see what our successes are in the classroom, what our successes might not be in the classroom, and whether we are changing and adapting our methodology, our pedagogy, so that it addresses the students that we have in front of us. Because as I mentioned, the students I have very specific challenges that they face. So the more that I recognize those and help to work with those, the better we're going to be. So I said I was going to give you homework. This is a review of the questions. So number 1, do you have a growth mindset? If you do, what evidence do you have of that? What was the most recent communicating activity that you've done? What do I know about my students? What do I know about their situation, my own positionality and their needs? How do we ensure that our students remember what we teach? So I really want to put memory front and center in the kind of practical ways that we foster teaching for success. Write down 5 things that you remember from this presentation. I hope you can think of 5. What helps you to learn? Because as I said earlier, it really does begin with us, with how we see learning. And then, as I said, the ultimate, would I like to be taught by me? Okay. So again, if you notice throughout the presentation, I gave you these questions earlier, and then in the summary, I gave them to you again. So it's a little bit of that spiral that I said of repetition. So what I would like to end on is to say thank you for listening to me. As I said, it's an honor and a privilege to be with you. I'm looking forward to answering your questions in the Q&A. I'm also just looking forward to listening to your own thoughts and your own practice in the classroom. I do believe very, very strongly that sharing means that the field will move forward. If you need to contact me, please do. This is my email, both my personal and my regular one. And then obviously my reading list. If you want to know what kind of research we're doing, then please email me. But otherwise, I shall see you at the Q&A.